Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Lauren McLemore, and I am the Associate Editor of Gemstones at National Jeweler. I'm pleased to welcome you to the latest episode of My Next Question, National Jeweler and Jewelers of America's co-branded webinar series. Today, Michelle Graff, Editor-in-Chief of National Jeweler, and Dave Bonaparte, President and CEO of Jewelers of America, are co-hosting a session on what to expect in the jewelry industry in 2024, joined by Sherry Smith, Director of Business Development at the Edge Retail Academy, and Paul Zimnisky, Industry Analyst at Paul Zimnisky Diamond Analytics. Before we get the webinar started, I just want to let attendees know that if they have a question, they can type it into the Zoom Q&A box. I'll be back on at the end of the discussion to share the questions. Also, today's session is being recorded and will be available on both the National Jeweler and Jewelers of America's websites later this week. Now, I'll hand it over to Michelle to get the discussion started, and I'll be back to field any questions at the end. Thank you.
You're on mute.
All right,
Michelle, you're on mute.
Sorry. So first, I know this is what to expect in 2024 webinar, but first, let's talk about what happened in 2023. Sherry, in your last column, you wrote that Independent Jewelers 2023 performance, quote, reveals a fascinating narrative of adaptation and resilience. Can you talk a little bit more about what you meant by that exactly, and also share some top-line data on Jewelers' performance last year, 2023? And Paul, feel free to jump in here with any data you have from last year as well.
Yep. So for clarification, I just want you guys to know I speak to the independent jewelers, not the industry as a whole. So just want that to be clear to our listeners. So yeah, what I meant by adaptation and resilience is that the independent jeweler successfully navigated various challenges, right? The talks of the economic slowdown, high interest rates, higher cost of living, and so forth. And I feel like they demonstrated the ability to withstand and thrive in that, in 2023. I also believe some of their successes can be attributed to their strong relationships with their local communities, which I think sets them apart and is a bigger challenge for the chain stores and the majors to do. And as to their resilience, I meant they were able to maintain or grow their business under these in the face of these adversities. So how did it all play out for our independent channel? Gross sales were down less than 1%, unit sales were down 4%, and the average retail sale was up 3%. The biggest increases we saw were in colored stone bracelets and necklaces, followed by watches. Diamond bracelets and diamond necklaces fared well, as did fashion gold jewelry.
Okay, thank you. Paul, any thoughts to add there?
Yeah, so I think we were, here a year ago, and the consensus was that there would be, teeth gnashing and people running around with their hands in the air. I mean, that never really transpired. And I think, a year ago, I pointed out that, people are still working. As long as people are working, I think we'll be okay. I mean, you need unemployment for a real hard-hitting recession. And, so much of our industry is tied to, the macro economy, and the Federal Reserve might just be threading the needle this time, which is ironic because there was so much vitriol towards the Fed. It reached, epic levels, over the last year, over the last 18 months. But they squeezed the economy, but they got what they wanted, which was a slowdown in, Silicon Valley, the tech industry, and real estate. And those were the two industries that were really overheated. And that's where we, have seen the layoffs in those two industries. But elsewhere, real wage growth, net of inflation has been positive. So I think that's kind of why we, maybe outperformed relative to expectations. I would also note that when you look at inflation, and everybody was concerned that, inflation would really impact the consumer, I think most people that buy fine jewelry own their homes, and they really haven't been exposed to, say, rent inflation, and rent was one of the greatest drivers of inflation over the last 2 years. So that's, I think, something else that maybe people don't really acknowledge. But overall, if I'm just looking at, say, the global diamond jewelry industry, I think, if we look at sales, I think we were down, anywhere from a mid to high single-digit % last year. I think the U.S. outperformed, especially compared to Asia. So that kind of takes us to 2024, which I think gets a little bit more difficult to forecast given all the catalysts we're going to have to deal with. But last year expectations were too low and we outperformed. This year expectations, maybe a little high, but I think we're going to have much more of a normal year, if you will, in 2024.
I would also point out, Sherry, that those results that you shared are coming off not just 1 year in which sales were exceptionally strong, but 2 years, 2021 and 2022. So when we're saying sales are flat or perhaps down a bit, I think it's a good thing to remember that jewelry had 2 exceptional years. In fact, the best years the industry has since I've been working here in 2007. Jewelry had 2 exceptional years in 2021 and 2022. So I don't think such a small slowdown in growth especially should not be a concern, because we are coming down off some very, very excellent years.
Record years ever, right?
Yeah, record years. So that's something else to keep in mind. I'm thinking back to our discussion last year. I think the industry did a lot better than I expected, and I think any of us sitting here today expected in 2023. And I think Paul's right. 2024, there's a lot going on. We're going to get to that. It's going to be a little harder to forecast. I want to talk about one more thing for 2023 before we move on. It's a question we get anytime we write about sales. And Sherry, you know what I'm going to ask you? Lab grown versus natural. And Paul, you can weigh in here too. So, what can you both tell our listeners about lab grown diamond sales in 2023? What percentage of the market do they have now? And do we know percentages of bridal versus fashion or non-bridal jewelry, however you want to phrase it? Sherry, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, so I can only speak to right now the sell-through loose of lab grown and diamonds. I prefer and instead of versus, but having said that, so we are currently building out our other product categories because more and more retailers are now expanding right beyond just loose and starting to carry lab grown categories. But for now, I will share the stats for how the loose performed in 2023. So for lab grown, gross sales were down 38%. Unit sales were down 18%, and the average retail sale was down 30%. Compared with natural, which was the gross sales were down 52%, unit sales were down 45%, and the average retail sale was down 16%. As far as the market share, we've seen them capture more market share year over year for the last 3 to 5 years, but it's still just under 10% of what we see in our sample for the independent channel. I'm sure Paul will have more he can elaborate on.
And you're saying this is just loose. That's just the data.
Just loose, yeah.
So then we're talking loose, then we're talking bridal for the most part.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Paul, what are your thoughts on lab grown versus natural? And I don't know how much data you have.
Going to be frank, I'm to the point with the lab grown where I'm somewhere between bored and annoyed with the product. At least is it, being sold as a low price clone of a natural diamond. And I think consumers are going to eventually get to that point too. I want to see something new and original with the way the product's being sold. That said, I think if we're looking at, proportion of sales for 2024, I'm forecasting that man-made diamond jewelry will breach the 20% threshold of total global diamond jewelry demand. And I actually just put out a piece of research you can find on my website, but one of the things I'm finding is that the overlap between, say, man-made and natural diamond is actually evolving, whereas, say, 10 years ago, somewhere close to 100% of man-made diamond jewelry sales meant that a natural diamond jewelry sale was lost. I think the overlap now is maybe 60%, meaning that 40% of man-made diamond jewelry sales now are incremental to the industry, meaning there's diamond jewelry sales that would not have ever happened if man-made diamond jewelry did not exist as a product. So I think that's kind of one of the big things to keep an eye on. And, that just has to do with the price differential. And we're getting to the point where the price differential is so wide. On Walmart.com's marketplace, you could buy a really nice 5-carat oval, man-made diamond with a IGI report for like $3,500. Like, it's getting to the point where the price differential is so wide, and that's an extreme example. That's why I'm giving that. But again, this product is bringing new, consumers to the industry, to the diamond industry. And I think you have to take that into account when you're analyzing this.
I would just jump in, Michelle, and say I agree with that assessment. The way we see it with at least our members that are reporting in on sales of lab grown, because of the drop in price, the significant drop in pricing, they are attracting new customers. I think that's the key. These are new consumers coming in, buying diamonds they might not normally buy, and therefore, to Paul's point, they look over in the corner and see something else of natural origin, and it opens up that opportunity for a sale. So I think what it's doing is it's creating a little bit more activity in a store, in a brick and mortar store. They might see it. I think to your point earlier, the price points are kind of dragging down average sale in all categories, and maybe margins are going up, but average revenues are kind of dropping in the diamond category in general. If you combine the two, natural and lab grown, I think what you said, Paul, is spot on. It's going eventually there'll be a different classification. You're not going to see apples to apples here, because it's not. There's no value after you buy a lab grown diamond and you walk out of the store. It's worse than buying a car. There's no resale value whatsoever. So people have to understand that and fully disclose, in which retailers, for the most part, do. They fully disclose the value. And that's all about that value. So I think those are good points you bring up.
I think we should clarify too, there's not necessarily a resale value of natural diamonds. I think that's something the industry has perpetuated for years and years and years.
Right.
Buy it, it's an investment, you're going to get
Right.
your money back. But they're not going to walk in even to a retail store and get their money back.
At least not what they paid, right?
Yeah, not close to what they paid. And I think the opposite's true of what you said as well, Dave. It's not just the lab grown customer that came in and might have some, future natural diamond activity. You have your natural diamond customer coming in and having some activity in the lab grown.
Right.
So yeah, and Paul, what I hear you saying is it is capturing more market share, which I think should be the hope of the industry. If we can capture more market share of the disposable dollar, because for decades we were losing it.
Right.
Right. Up until COVID, we were losing market share.
Yeah, luxury goods.
We're
We're
losing
losing luxury category for sure. Yeah.
Yeah,
And just
absolutely.
maybe one final comment on that when we're looking at, say, overlap. I mean, I don't see why, man-made diamond jewelry isn't going to end up being a substitute for CZ or white sapphire or moissanite. I mean, I think that whole, fashion, say lower price gem category or diamond simulant category, there's a huge opportunity for lab grown diamond. And I think that's something we're going to see, kind of play out throughout,
Good
the
point.
end of this decade. As prices get lower, you'll see more overlap with those diamond simulants.
And I think there are categories that they're branching out into, Riviera necklaces, bracelets, pendants. I mean, they went heavily into loose. Now they're going, oh, wait a minute, there's other product categories that we can get into. So it will be interesting to see how it plays out.
On that note, I want to move on to 2024. I don't want to lose Paul with the lab grown diamond discussion. So we're coming off what we've already established was a pretty solid year for independent jewelers. So what do you see happening in the market this year for both independents and the majors? What do you think will be the strongest categories product-wise? And Paul, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think as far as particulars, it's really, really hard to say. I think when I'm looking, say on a more macro basis, again, I think we're going to revert to maybe those pre-pandemic growth rates. I think, a low to mid-single-digit % growth rate this year is possible. It looks like that the Fed is going to loosen policy and reduce interest rates. It's probably going to be at a less magnitude and at a slower pace than maybe the market's anticipating right now. But that's something that can be a real macroeconomic catalyst for the diamond purchasing consumer. And again, I think the further we get away from the pandemic era volatility, that helps with consumer sentiment. It seems like that volatility we had where consumers were buying, material, luxury items when they couldn't, go out during the lockdowns. And then, last year, obviously, we saw a huge return to the service, luxury experience, economy. Again, I think we may kind of revert back to consumers, buying material luxury items again. So again, I think that the main takeaway here is I think volatility that we saw the last 3-4 years is going to start to to settle down. And again, I think 2024 is actually going to feel like a much more normal pre-pandemic year, if you will.
Feeling like more like 2019, 2018,
Right.
along those lines. Sherry, what's your take on 2024? And I'm particularly interested if you have any thoughts about categories, because I know you did that great article for us a couple weeks ago, where it's a category by category breakdown of the strongest performers in 2023. Any ideas on 2024?
Well, I think diamond categories will continue to be an important part to the industry. I mean, they've always fallen somewhere between 45 to 50% of annual sales. So I don't see that going away, even as the number of engagements and weddings settle down. But I do think we've seen some interesting trends that I'm hoping will continue to flourish. Colored stone jewelry being highlighted and experience some growth. Fashion gold again. I mean, that used to be a staple and a bread and butter. We're seeing some surges there, particularly in yellow gold. So I'm hoping to see more of those. I mean, again, I agree with everybody. 2024 will be very challenging to predict, but I don't see us wavering too far away from our core diamond categories. And the watch business will be interesting to see. You know, how long will luxury watches be on the rise? Again, they've done very well in the last 4 or 5 years. So it'll be interesting to see, does that continue to play out? Even though units are coming down a bit, the average retail sales going up. So that's an interesting category as well. And I do think, again, tying into the engagements and the number of weddings, I think some of the bridal declines we saw last year are because the numbers are getting back down to pre-pandemic.
You were going to talk about bridal more specifically in a little bit, but before you move on, I want to talk a little bit about this. 2024 is an election year, and I'm going to actually pull from one of the questions we had submitted beforehand. Historically, how has that affected the jewelry space, if at all? Like, does that affect consumer sentiment, consumer behavior? Does that, I mean, especially like towards the end of the year at all? Is there ever any big effect? Because I remember just anecdotally speaking to retailers years ago, and in election years, they always said their business was always a little bit strange. So I don't know what your thoughts are on kind of like jewelry in an election year. And Dave, I don't know if you want to weigh in there. I know you've been through quite a few elections.
Mhm. Well, sure. I mean, I'll start off by saying, what we find through election years has been, while there's some caution and optimism, depending on, what's happening in the political arena, it always goes back to consumer confidence and, the health of the stock market and geopolitical, macroeconomic geopolitical issues. So as long as there's not any of that tied to an election, we usually don't see from our members any large swing in demand from their consumers. So if the stock market's steady, all of the other market indicators are in check, we don't really see that much of a big movement. The one thing I will say from a governmental standpoint that to look out for in 2024 is the G7's announcement on what they're going to do with Russian diamonds and how they're going to impose import restrictions on all diamonds that originate from Russia. So that's coming down the pike. There's not a lot of detail, but if it is implemented into March 1st, in terms of polished diamonds over 1 carat, which is what they're saying, depending on the mechanism they put in place, it could hamper or disrupt the flow in the market the way it currently happens. And I can only be generic in this because there's no specific detail from government on this or the G7, and that is ongoing. So I would pay attention to that. If you're listening to this, just keep your eye on this piece of the market because it affects all the African diamond producers as well, because it's all diamonds. So it's something to keep your eye on.
Yeah, and just to clarify, the March 1st deadline is for, we already actually technically have a ban on diamonds from Russia in the United States that I think Biden signed an executive order, I believe in 2022. I'm not remember.
Yeah.
But this March 1st deadline is for substantial transformation, which refers to diamonds that were mined in Russia and, quote, substantially transformed elsewhere, i.e. India, meaning that for a long time there was this kind of, it's not a loophole, I don't know how to describe it, but because of substantial transformation, goods that were mined in Russia but cut and polished in India were considered products of India and still could come in the country.
And it's still
the
the case.
G7 is aiming to shut that down as of March 1st. But if they said we don't have any more details on how exactly that's going to work, but we'll keep you informed with anything you know. That's
Yeah,
a
and
good
just
point,
to
Dave.
tack on one point of information there. You know, they're saying that there's going to be, they're going to establish a robust traceability-based verification and certification mechanism. Okay. So depending on what that mechanism is, it really depends on what's going to happen. We don't know what that mechanism is at this moment.
Sherry,
Right.
Yeah,
ahead, Michelle.
yeah, Michelle, I just was, as a former owner, retail operator, I can tell you I went through many elections as well. And exactly what Dave is describing, while there's nervousness and chatter and depending on who you're for and who's going to get in office, things could get quiet a little bit in October and November, but business as a whole continued. And then right after election, it didn't matter who won. It was, okay, now we know. And
Right.
everybody went back to business, normally. What worries me more is when retailers get caught up into it, oh, it's election year, I got to be really conservative, and they start to pull back on the best practices and execution, then that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I can tell you historically, we don't see a huge change in the numbers.
Right. Still anniversaries, still engagements, there's still birthdays, there's
Still
still
holidays.
milestone. So that doesn't end.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add on the election catalyst. So if we're looking at, say, consumer sentiment, if we're looking at the stock market, doesn't like surprises, like political gridlock.
Right.
Typically before an election year, there is not a whole lot of policy that gets done. So that's good, from that standpoint. But if we
Because
do
policy
see,
often leads to gridlock anymore. So
yeah, but if we do see, a replay of Biden v. Trump, things could certainly get weird again. So that I would say that could have, the opposite impact. Yeah, it could be an unusual year as that approaches.
Or deja.
There was an article just a few days ago in Wall Street Journal that said for the first time, American consumer sentiment was actually positive after a long while of not having it. So that was interesting to see as well. And maybe that's contributing to them still spending. And as Paul indicated, they're still working. We're still short of bodies in the workforce. So hopefully, yeah, it'll be interesting.
yeah, it'll be quite a different world for us when we're sitting here next year at this time, hopefully.
Yep.
So what do you think, Sherry and Paul, and Sherry, I'll start with you on this one. What do you think are going to be the biggest challenges for retailers this year? Do you think that perhaps do you think some retailers have been lulled into a sense of thinking that sales are going to be pandemic levels forever and are kind of forgetting their best practices? What do you think is or the pitfalls this year for retailers?
I don't think they've been lulled. No, I think, they every year when we're working with the retail clients that we do, they're always like, oh my gosh, what do I expect? And we can't have another year like we just did, so there's a little bit of a realistic sort of mentality. I think the bigger concern is because there's talk of all of this and the uncertainties, right, that we're discussing even right now, they start to pull back on the best practices. So the biggest challenge will be is to actually continue to implement and execute, do what you're supposed to do. Even if the economy does change and changes drastically, it doesn't fall off the cliff. It doesn't generally become non-existent. It just means we have to work harder for the business that we capture. So I always worry about the retailers, particularly who rode the wave the last few years, right? They made no changes. They didn't evolve their business model. They didn't tweak anything, but they rode the wave, right? Because everybody was going to jewelry. We had 2 record years. And even last year, with everything opened up and competing for the disposable dollar, they managed to hang on to 99% of what they did in record years. Those are the ones we worry about, right? Because they're not implementing, they're not executing, they're not evolving their business model, and they're going to continue to close. So to me, the challenges are keep doing what you should be doing in your business. Right? Keep looking at your data, keep following best practices, keep executing, and you'll be fine. Those retailers will be fine. It's my 2 cents.
Paul,
I guess,
go ahead.
yeah, I would just add, consumers want newness. They always want newness. They want something that gets them excited, something, that's going to bring them into the store. And I think that's why lab grown has been such a huge topic, within our industry and with the consumer. It's new. It's finally like a new diamond product, and customers crave newness, and it's difficult to, with the jewelry industry in particular, kind of given, what it traditionally is. to create newness and excitement. And, that comes from, jewelry designs and new materials, and it comes from, new ways of marketing and branding and, that sort of thing. And I think that's always the biggest challenge. I think that's always what, makes the industry, outperform or underperform, with diamonds. It's been, a struggle in the post De Beers monopoly era, with regard to marketing. It's like everybody wants somebody else to spend the money on the marketing. The Natural Diamond Council, I think, was a huge, was a huge catalyst for progress in this area. That organization lost Rosa's funding a couple years ago. I mean, it's been a difficult, stretch. But I think marketing is huge. It's probably the most important, aspect of this industry that maybe we don't pay enough attention to. But marketing, branding, that's kind of what makes or breaks this industry. And with that, you need new products to get consumers excited.
No, that's definitely true. Dave, I'm sorry, did you want to add something?
No, I agree with that sentiment completely. We've always lagged in the luxury space in marketing versus other goods like handbags and shoes and other things. And when companies like De Beers, like they did in the last quarter, spent over $20 million to boost the market. A lot of it was spent in the United States. That always helps. But that is a big challenge, continue to be a big challenge, especially in the U.S. market.
Well, they spend it in the U.S. market because I think it's their biggest market.
Right.
But just on that note, I think there needs to be a balance, right? There's a balance of new product. Look, we've got tons of designers. They're constantly throwing new product at the wall, and retailers are happy to buy and try new over and over and over again. It is probably lack of marketing. It's the best kept secret in their communities, in their neighborhoods. But there's also a balance with looking at the data and what's working, right? And not being so quick not to put that back in. Even other luxury worlds, handbags, as you mentioned, Dave, shoes, they don't make one bag for an entire market and then go on to, they make enough for a market that they can sell numerous units before they move on and introduce a new product or a new collection. I think sometimes we're too quick to move on from stuff that's working really well, sort of the core business, the core essentials. But yes, it should be a balance between new and fast-selling product that's working well.
Yeah, and Michelle, just one last comment on challenges for 24. We've all seen, the increase in retail crime. There's there are a lot of bills on the floor right now. The anti-retail crime bill. You see it on the news all the time. The smash and grabs against jewelers. The JSA is doing an excellent job with local law enforcement, the FBI, trying to prevent these things from happening. But that's a real deterrent for retail jewelers. It's top of mind. They're concerned about it, and we're trying to work hard to develop solutions to prevent this from escalating. So it's something to look out for. And I know most jewelers are very in tune with their security. I'm sure, Sherry, you see it all the time. A lot of these fine independent retail jewelers are very up on the latest technology to protect their employees and their store and their local community. So it's something to look out for, and I think it's going to continue to be a challenge in 24.
Look for that expose, Dave, on how they've misrepresented the actual number of smash and grab.
Yeah, I will. I do. When we keep in touch with it and close ties with the JSA. But nonetheless, I mean, and one is too many, I mean, it's
absolutely. But
Jerry, just to clarify, it's not the Jeweler Security Alliance misrepresenting. You're talking.
No.
I just want to be clear. That's not what you're saying.
No, but there was just recently an expose on this overinflated misrepresentation as a whole in our country of smash and grab and these criminals going in and taking all this product. You should look for it and watch it. It was very informative and very insightful.
I'll take a look.
So I want to talk a little bit. Paul just mentioned lab grown as a new product. So where do you think the lab grown market will be a year from now? We know prices have fallen a lot. We've seen some players have gone out of business. Some players have said, we're now refocusing our business on industrial diamonds. So do you think that'll continue? And will the stones remain popular with consumers? What are we going to be saying from lab grown diamonds a year from now, do you think? Paul, I'll start with you.
Well, I think we're going to get to the point where, the strategy of just riding on the coattails of the natural diamond industry is going to run its course. Um, and that's kind of where the, the easy money is. And I think that's why that's a segment the industry is focused on. I think the next stage is going to be, and this is something, we've discussed in the past, Michelle, but using the product in a way that you can't with natural diamond, whether it's, custom or original colors or shapes that wouldn't be economic to cut into with natural diamond. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, but they require more work. And I think that the next phase of lab-grown diamond jewelry is going to be more unique jewelry that competes less directly with natural diamond. Because right now it's just basically who can, produce and sell the cheapest, lab-grown diamond that is competing with the natural diamond. And I think we are, kind of getting towards the end of that phase. And I mean, you just look at the other, man-made gems, ruby, emerald, sapphire. They've been around for decades now. It's like nobody wants to talk about that. I mean, nobody's interested. It's just it's kind of a boring product at this point that provides a good value. You can get a beautiful, man-made ruby for 1 carat, high quality for $75 at K Jewelers outlet, and it's a nice piece of jewelry, but nobody's excited about it at this point. So I think we could be headed that way with just generic, simple man-made diamonds. So again, I think the next phase of that industry is going to have to be doing something that's different and something that's original. And I think we're going to maybe finally start seeing some of that this year or next.
Okay.
So regards to the ruby and the emeralds, they never look like rubies and emeralds. So that's the first thing I'll clarify. As a former retailer, the synthetic never did what the man-made diamond is doing, right? For in lab grown, relatively compared to a natural diamond. I do think we're going to see less and less vendors in the lab grown world, right? We'll see the bigger companies probably buy up the little companies, or the little companies go away. And I think that will be good to help with the pricing. It'll settle down and stabilize. And we hope it does, right? Because I don't think it'll be good for our industry if it gets down to a $79, $95 product. First of all, I don't think it can be produced for that little and sold that, at that rate. And I hope not. Because
I think it can't produce the way it should be produced for
Right.
that.
Right, exactly. And I think it's an opportunity to capture more market share. I think I don't believe they have to be mutually exclusive. I think if our industry can be receptive to the idea that we can have both and we can successfully navigate both,
Right.
and with its own story in our store, it could be a really great thing for the industry. It doesn't have to be a bad thing. I mean, yes, we need the prices to stabilize, right? And we need some things to continue to happen. I think the expansion of the other product categories. And I think if people got really granular and started looking at the consumers who were buying this, they're ultimately the deciding factor. And you've got women who have beautiful natural diamond jewelry who are okay with acquiring lab grown, because they still want the vacation and they still want the Mercedes in the front yard. But you know what? I'll take the 4 carat lab grown diamond studs because they go with my wardrobe and I don't care. There's a lot of that going on, I think, that we don't always look at. And then there will be part of it, I think, will that rural young couple who only ever thought they could have a 1/3 of a carat or a 1/2 carat diamond engagement ring, who can now have a 1.5 carat, will they ever go back and settle? I don't know that they will, So again, I think both stories can exist. And I think it's an opportunity for our industry if we can be embracing. Our industry is notorious for not embracing change or disruptors. And we can all name many of those that have come along the way. E-commerce, do you remember that? Everybody was going to boycott every vendor who ever had an e-commerce or website. So I hope it doesn't get to that. I'm not wishing that for our industry. Again, I'm wishing for capturing more market share, getting the price to stabilize, and being able to have 2 great stories within your business, your retail business.
And Sherry, when you're saying capturing more market share, you're essentially agreeing with what Paul said earlier, is we are getting people who weren't going to buy diamonds to buy a diamond product.
Absolutely. Or who only ever thought they were going to have an engagement ring and wedding band, and jewelry was just not going to be, part of what they acquired in their lifetime. Yeah.
I would also point out that I've seen, to Paul's point about the shapes and colors, we've kind of seen this happening already. I believe it was Fred, which is an LVMH brand, did that special blue diamond. They had this capri blue color. It's kind of a signature color for them. And they made a diamond that would not grow in nature of that exact blue color. And then also, I believe it was, I can't remember, maybe it was Prada, I think, started cutting diamonds in the shape of the little kind of,
Logo.
yeah, their little triangle, I guess you would call it, kind of a rounded triangle. So I think we've seen like some of that already. So I think it's also going to depend on which end of the market you're talking about, you know.
Mhm.
And I think you're right, Sherry. I think there's no reason people couldn't have both. People couldn't say, I'd like, you know, a natural diamond engagement ring, but also a lab grown tennis bracelet. Or,
And I
you know, or I'll take, you know, bigger lab grown studs, but I want to keep, you know, my anniversary band natural. I think they can exist. I don't know if we ever talked, but one time I was having a conversation with the CEO of Antoine Bourdet, who's the CEO of Lightbox, and he was saying he came from World Cosmetics, and he was saying how, you know, in cosmetics, when they look at like mascara, for example, women have everything in their makeup drawer, from $50 Lancome or Chanel. I don't know who makes expensive mascara. I don't buy it, but from very expensive mascara to Maybelline that they bought at the drugstore for $3.99. And he's like, I don't, you know, he's like, I kind of seen that the diamond industry can have both, that you can have a woman that has a range of products in her jewelry box at all different price points that she bought for all different occasions and reasons. That's just how I look at it anyway. I don't know if that's
I agree with that. I agree. I think our industry sometimes doesn't want to listen to the consumer. And I think we should listen to the consumer. If the consumer comes in and they're okay, look, we still inform them. We still need to be educated, right? We need to be able to speak to both the natural, both the lab grown. But if it's an add-on for them, you know, wardrobe accessory, and they're okay with it, then why should I not be okay with it? You know what I mean? It's the same. And you're exactly right. That description of cosmetics is bang on. You will see in somebody's makeup repertoire, you know, the $50 to $75 piece of cosmetic right down to the drugstore cosmetic.
Right.
Yeah,
And just
I mean,
maybe
I'd just say
to,
that it's a viable product. There's no question about it. Paul, go ahead.
I was just going to say, you know, just speaking to the point that Michelle brought up with Fred. So Fred's one of the smaller LVMH brands, but they generated a tremendous amount of buzz. So they produced an ocean blue man-made diamond that was used in a special collection. It was a very exclusive collection. It wasn't a highly distributed collection by any means, but there's a lot of interest, and that was clear by how much, you know, media coverage it got. And on the LVMH analyst call, somebody asked a question about it, and the CEO said, this is the first time Fred's ever come up in, you know, the 20 years we've been doing these calls. So, and then the CEO of Fred got promoted shortly thereafter. So the point being is there's still, you know, a tremendous amount of interest here. We're talking about, you know, man-made diamond, even at the high, you know, the higher end, you know, we're talking about an LVMH brand. So, so yeah, I think we will continue to see more of this given the response.
yeah, I thought that was a really interesting move. And we actually, to your point, Paul, we actually wrote about that collection, and it got a tremendous response from our readers as well. It was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the way to get creative and think outside the box.
Dave, I'm sorry, did you want to jump in and say something?
No, good.
Okay, so I want to move on a little bit. We're running short of time here, and talk about the marriage market. So Signet is predicting a bridal rebound after slowdown engagements in 2023. Just to sketch this out for everybody, Signet's modeling shows that, and I would buy this, that people tend to get engaged 3 years after they meet somebody. That seems about right to me. So what they're saying is in 2020, people couldn't meet. So last year would have been that would have been 3 years for those people who would have met in 2020. But, you know, there weren't a lot of couples being made because of the pandemic. So they saw a slowdown in engagement ring sales last year. So they're saying they think there's going to be a rebound beginning this year. I think it'll be interesting to see where the marriage rate, which just as a note has been on the decline since the 80s, where's the marriage rate goes in the coming years. What are your thoughts? Because I would also note here, there were a lot of weddings in 2020. It was a boom year for weddings, but that wasn't because people are changing their thoughts about getting married. That was because those were people who couldn't get married in 2020 or 2021, had to postpone their weddings. So, and I did an article about this, and we kind of laid this all out. So what are your thoughts on the bridal market this year and the bridal market kind of going forward? I'm personally curious to see if COVID will have will the marriage rate start to go back up after COVID because people will think, oh, well, actually, I don't want to be alone? Or will this have changed how people approach marriage and dating entirely? I think it'll be really, I don't have an answer. I just think it'll be really interesting to see how that kind of extended period of separation changes how we look at pairing up, essentially. So
Yeah.
any thoughts about the marriage market, the bridal market in 2024?
I would just say I think it maybe makes sense to kind of look at the longer term trend and not get too caught up in the pandemic related volatility. I think when we look on I think you can look at gross versus per capita marriage rates. On a per capita basis, the trend isn't great. But when we look at nominal engagements and weddings, there's still longer term growth because, we have population increase. So I think, as long as we continue to have population increase in the US, I think that's kind of what we want to focus more on gross numbers and not necessarily get too caught up in per capita, even though that trend is down. And just maybe an interesting, anecdote that I keep getting from, say independents here in the US is that, the Hispanic population in particular, they like diamonds and they tend to disproportionately like natural diamonds. And that's one of the, fastest growing demographics in the US. So maybe just something to keep in mind that I think is interesting when we're talking about the bridal market.
Okay, interesting. Sherry, what are your thoughts about the bridal market?
Yeah, so all of that's already in our bridal market numbers. I don't know. I mean, I read all of that about Signet too, and we track the number of engagements, obviously, and look at the data that we share with our independents. And it dropped to 1.7 in 2020. And again, depending on what source you look at. And then it rebounded in 21 and 22, up to 2.5 to 2.8, depending on what source you look at, million. And now it seems to be settling back down to around the 2.2. And historically, we used to see it around 2 million, right? Anywhere from 2 to 2.2 million. So will there be a surge? I mean, it suggests that in 2020 in its entirety, we were closed from January 1st through December 31st, and nobody met anybody. But it really wasn't quite equal that way. I mean, different sections of the country were closed in different, capacities and so forth. So I'm not sure it was like quite non-existent and that no relationships were to be had. And then suddenly
I don't think anybody said no relationships will be
Yeah.
formed, but I think they were saying fewer people were meeting than would meet in a
Well,
normal year.
and
I
in
mean, it's very
lockdown,
hard to quantify, but I think
yeah,
that's what we're
it is
saying.
hard to quantify. I think that's the thing. And I think, we do have years of data on it. Look, it's hard to say, but to me, I think what we saw in 2023 in the decline of bridal sales was because the numbers were settling back down to what they were pre-COVID. So I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting theory, that, people might not have met, but we were open back up in 21 and 22 and 23. And, so I don't know. I don't know that there's going to be this sudden boom in marriages. And I agree with you, Michelle, the data prior to COVID was marriages were on the decline anyway.
Right.
And
I don't know that, I mean, just to clarify, I don't think Signet was saying that it thought that there was going to be a boom. I think it said that it thought that there was a dip last year because it's 3 years after 2020 and it was going to normalize this year. I don't know that Signet was ever saying they expected a boom. I think the word they used actually was a rebound. But I don't know, I think it'll be interesting to see kind of where that goes in the coming years.
yeah, it will be interesting to follow for sure.
So we're gonna move into questions here. One last question from me though. If you could summarize your thoughts and predictions for 2024 in a few words, what would they be?
We did this last year and it was very difficult.
Well, I remember last year we talked about the concerns were consumer confidence, inflation, interest rates, all of those things affecting the market potentially negatively, and we got through it pretty well. I would just say that I think we're in a better place than we were at this time last year in that particular discussion in terms of inflation was starting to spike at the time, interest rates were increasing, the real estate market was down. That's starting to wane a little bit. Like we just commented earlier on the fact that the Fed's probably going to cut the rate in the next quarter. So you'll see some easing there. I think it's just stability. As long as there's nothing, I mean, I don't know much more could go wrong from a geopolitical standpoint than what's been going on right now. There's so much that is so bad that usually does affect the market in a negative way. But as long as we don't have any escalation in that regard, and it kind of gets a little bit more stable, I think we're looking at a solid year. I'm cautiously optimistic, and I say that in talking to our members, and that's what our members feel. I think your lab grown comments are spot on. I think we're going to see the bottom of the lab grown pricing in next year, and where that's going to go, and whether that becomes a new opportunity for new types of finished jewelry and new ideas. But I'm optimistic, as are our members.
Sherry or Paul, you want to summarize 2024 in a few words before we move on to questions?
Yeah, I guess I would just echo what I said before. I think it's gonna we're gonna see a reversion to more normalcy. I think which will be nice. If I think we need to keep an eye on one variable, I would look at employment in the U.S. As long as people are still working, they're still going to shop, they're still going to buy jewelry. I do think things could get a little bit weird as the election approaches. So I think that's kind of the big variable. I think overall, I think the U.S. will probably outperform on a relative global basis again. But keep an eye on employment. That's kind of I think the one variable that's going to probably be the best proxy for what 2024 turns out to be.
I just want to go on record as saying Dave stole my cautiously optimistic from last year.
It's such an
How
easy
much-
thing.
I don't know that, I think there's been so much cautious optimism is the most used descriptor for this industry overall, I think.
Yeah, so it is tough. It's really tough to predict this year, but I do think we will see slight declines. I do. And here's why. I do also believe that we will have retailers who will absolutely outperform the industry because they are the ones who've done all the right things and continue to execute. I believe we will continue to see stores close because they haven't done any of the things they should have done, right? And now it's like, oh, okay, we'll retire or do a GOB. So it makes it really, really hard to say what we'll do, this year. Last year, I think I was predicting single-digit declines. I wouldn't even know, but I do think it would be really hard to keep holding this up, keep grabbing hold of what they did in their record years. So I remain cautiously optimistic. Again, we have many retailers who outperform the industry as much as 20 and 25%. So I believe we're still going to see that, but I think there will be others that struggle.
Yeah, I think one thing I'd like to say in the optimistic note is I think retailers have gotten so much better. I mean, I think they were basically forced by the pandemic, but have gotten so much better about embracing technology. And I would say this is just an anecdotal note, but when TikTok came around, retailers were right on it. They were jumping in, they were experimenting. I see so many of them and you see this on Reels too, because Instagram now has its own Reels. That is such a huge thing for consumers, particularly young consumers. They spend a lot of time on TikTok, a lot of time on Reels. And I was very happy to see, whereas in the past, retailers were kind of hesitant about social media or didn't quite see how it was going to benefit their business.
Right.
I think this time around, as soon as they were like, okay, TikTok, I'm going to get on this. I'm going to try this. And I think a lot of them are doing a great job. And I think it partially speaks to what you said, Sherry, the ones who are left are the ones who were doing it right all along. But I'm also, that makes me optimistic for the future to see so many of them embracing something. Whereas in the past, as you noted, we're not an industry that likes to embrace or try new things. And I think we kind of learned our lesson the first time social media came around and a lot of retailers got left in the dust.
Maybe just to add on to your comment about technology, I think when I think about diamonds and we talked a little bit about the Russian sanctions, but we're basically going to use technology to trace the source of a natural diamond, and this is going to be a huge change for the supply chain, and I think for the level of transparency and the overall diamond industry. I mean, we're going to ultimately be able to tell consumers at least the country of origin of most of the diamonds. And I think there's a huge opportunity there to leverage that and to use that with the way that you sell a diamond.
I mean, how many other products have been doing that for years? this coffee is from here, this
Right.
was made
Right.
here. Like
And
we're
diamonds
behind in that arena.
Right, and it's so much more expensive than coffee or organic vegetables. I mean, this should have been, something that I think the industry really should have aggressively dug into years ago when there were some green shoots with regard to this sort of strategy, but I think it's really, the sanctions are really going to be the catalyst that makes it mainstream. And there's a huge opportunity here. And I really hope that the industry, embraces it and kind of uses this with their selling strategies. Because I really think it quells all of, or most of the natural diamond industry's challenges where, it's if you can tell the customer where it came from, they know it's not a blood diamond, they know it's a real natural diamond. And it's a way to differentiate it from, a man-made diamond that was produced in China or India. So,
And it's a way to tell the story of this is where it came from and this is who touched it and this is how it
absolutely.
benefits their lives. And that's a big deal for consumers, particularly for younger consumers. I'm sorry. Go
100%.
ahead, Dave.
I'll say that I agree with you that technology could enhance that process, but it's important to note that there are very good examples of how that is occurring now, that you can identify where your diamond came from through certain channels and depending on who you buy from. So I'm not saying it's perfect, but yeah, I think the ability and the possibility of it getting better and more efficient is good outlook for the industry in terms of identifying where all goods come from.
Yeah,
If
definitely.
it's leveraged, right? If it's leveraged.
Yeah, it's just got to be fair and open to everybody in the industry. It's got to be accessible to, all the diamond producers and everyone down or up the supply chain, up and down the supply chain. So
Sure.
it's tricky. It's tricky. We could have a whole webinar on that for like 3 hours.
I'm sure we probably will at some point, right? I
Yeah,
know
we
it's a
should. We
schedule.
actually should.
So thank you, Sherry, Paul, Dave, thank you so much. I'm going to toss it back over to Lauren. She's going to come in now with some Q&A. Lauren?
Thanks, everyone. That was a great discussion. And as a reminder to those tuning in, you can still type your questions into the Zoom Q&A box, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. I'm going to start with some of the questions that were submitted beforehand. So on the topic of technology, our first question is, how is AI being utilized in the design, customization, and market analysis of jewelry, and what impact do you foresee it having?
Interesting. Some places are using it there, but you have to do a lot of work, right? You have to train it and feed it the information, but you can use it for data analysis. You can plug in your data and do identify consumer preferences. I have retailers who are using AI to help them with marketing campaigns. There's a lot of things that I'm seeing that they're starting to use and embrace. And to Michelle's point, I think COVID was sort of an eye opener, like, oh, we better, be willing to adapt and be agile and adopt these best practices moving forward. So we're seeing it, and it's supposedly supposed to be able to use for automation and so forth, responding the right way in text or to reviews and so forth. And I think we're going to see more and more retailers adopt that.
Anna, one thing, I'll jump in here real quick. You asked about design, Lauren. Now, I haven't heard of much, and this would be interesting to know. And if anyone knows about this, please reach out and let me know. But people using it to help design a piece of jewelry so much. But I did speak to one designer who was saying that she was actually using it to help her write descriptions for her website. Designers, particularly independent designers, they have a lot on their plate. They're designing jewelry, they're handling customer relations. They've got to hire somebody to handle the website, their social media. There's a lot for them to do. And she was saying that she originally had the woman who built her website write the descriptions for her products, but it wasn't really her wheelhouse. And
Right.
she said, now, I kind of, feed it a few things, whatever the
Train
product
it, yep.
is, and it comes up with a pretty good description. She's like, I have to buff it up a little bit to, make sense for my site. She's like, but it's a really smart use for her. So I think sometimes we get caught up in the, oh my God, AI, and it's mind blowing, but I think it has a lot of really good little uses that people can, and it's good to point out, you can't just feed it information and it's not going to be perfect when it comes back out. You're going to have to do some work. But in the case of this designer, she was like, well, this is one less thing, my web tech has to deal with writing these descriptions, and it's really working for her. So I think there are small ways people can make it work for them without getting too involved or having to know too much about it. That's just
Right.
one example I know about. Paul, I'm sorry I cut you off.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm glad somebody asked that question, because as much as we talk about AI, I feel like we aren't talking about it enough. I mean, we're talking the biggest change to the human species since electricity, since the computer, since the internet. It's definitely in that category. I mean, the rate of progression is just hard to process. This is going to be the biggest change to our lives, and it's probably going to play out in the next 5 to 10 years in a way we could have never, possibly imagined. I don't know. I think if you aren't a little bit concerned about the impact that AI is going to have on us, you aren't really paying attention. So I'm glad somebody brought it up, because this is something that should be talked about. I think more so than it even is.
And it's, again,
Yeah.
probably a topic for an entirely different webinar.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that if you bring it back down to the jewelry industry, you think about the fact that the jewelry industry in general is kind of behind the times in tech over the years. And I think AI has
That's putting it nicely.
well, a little bit, and I think we'd all admit it. But I think that now with AI, I think the ability for jewelers to quickly advance and use it as a tool to jumpstart those marketing campaigns or some of the strategy discussions and some of that stuff, as opposed to designing. It's a little difficult to imagine AI designing a piece of jewelry, because I'm not a jewelry designer, but I'm sure that application exists and people are using it. But I think there's a lot of opportunity in AI in jewelry. As far as overall, I totally agree that it's a massive tech opportunity for many, and almost daunting, and now we'll see where it's going to go.
So I think of all the retailers who don't do email blast, who don't post on social media because they're
Right.
like, I don't know what to say. I am not creative.
Yeah.
They can utilize this in a
Jump
really
starts
great
it.
way.
Yep. Yep. Agreed.
Yeah, I think you can use it to do some things you don't have the skill set for, or you don't have the manpower for. And again, it's not going to spit out something perfect. You're going to have to work on it a little bit, but it's going to get you 85, 90% of the way there.
More than they were doing because they
Right,
were
right.
overwhelmed and just would
Right.
avoid it, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So our next question is, how will the new $2,000 plus price of gold affect sales of gold jewelry?
I think, Paul, you could jump into this one, but I think, obviously, the higher price gold, the higher price your jewelry, because the manufacturing costs are going to increase. That's the simplest view. I mean, I think I don't know about how that will affect demand, but there's also opportunities in the resale market of gold for those who bought it on a low side. So there's kind of
How
both
long
sides.
has it been at 2000? I mean, gold, fashion gold jewelry was one of the categories that did well. in the
Yeah.
I
fourth
was going to say, I feel like the gold price has been high
for
for
a while.
not, I
right,
mean, it always makes headlines when it tops 2000, but
right.
it's been pretty high for a while. I mean, it's
Yeah.
been high at least since the start of the war, I would guess. So that would have been why can't I remember? 2021? The
Yeah. I
war
mean,
in
it's
Ukraine.
still,
So I think that, yeah, I think Sherry's right. I think that, I don't know. That's always a question that comes up, and people are always really interested in the price of gold. But I feel like it's been high, maybe not $2,000 an ounce high, but I feel like it's been high for a while, and people are
It's been
still
pretty
buying.
high, yeah.
Because it's on, it's on trend. For a while there, yellow gold jewelry wasn't selling because it just wasn't in fashion. People were
Right.
wearing white gold. And I think it kind of, I don't know, in my mind, it kind of always just swings back and forth. At some point, people will get sick of yellow gold, or someone will come out with something interesting in a white metal, and people will swing back to that.
Mhm.
So I
Well,
don't,
we're seeing a surge in yellow again, and it used to
Yes.
be,
Yes.
the dominant
Agreed.
metal, so.
Yep.
I would just add that I think it's easier to make the case that the price of gold is too low than too high, to be honest. I think when you look at what drives gold price, a lot of it's investment, and the emergence of cryptocurrency actually took a bit out of gold. Now that crypto and there's a Bitcoin ETF that makes it more easy to invest, and I think that's actually going to be a situation where it could mark like a near-term top in Bitcoin, and we may see cryptocurrencies sell off, and that actually could put a bid back in gold. So that's just maybe one reason you could argue that gold price may be higher a year from now. That said, we're talking about fine jewelry. I think consumers are they want to buy precious materials, and they're willing
Right.
to spend willing to spend. And you look at China and India, where gold makes up a large majority of jewelry sales. it really hasn't hasn't had a a negative impact. If anything, it's a positive impact because
They see it
people
as
that
an
have bought,
investment.
Yep.
right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So I'm going to pull our next question from the Zoom Q&A back to the topic of election years. Someone is asking if anyone can speak to the value of buying advertising in an election year. There's nothing cheaper than the political rate in traditional media.
It's a tricky question. I've never tracked the advertising rates during an election year versus non-election year, so I don't think I could comment on the effect of that.
It would never be about the cost. It's about the return on investment, right?
Right.
If it's incredibly expensive, but you get a huge return, then it's worth it. If you're not going to get a return, then it's not. A lot of retailers.
If it's incredibly cheap and no one's going to see it, then what's the point?
What's the point, right?
Yeah.
So I would, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, Sherry, go ahead.
I was going to say, measure whatever marketing you're doing really, really well. And then ask yourself, even if it is cheap, what is the cost relative to other marketing mediums that you're already currently using? And what kind of return are you already getting on them? You know what I mean? So would it be a waste? I don't know. Like, again, look at your whole marketing spend and decide if you really need to go there and what kind of return you believe you're going to get.
I think the message through there is don't alter your marketing plan. Try to improve it, but don't alter it just because of an election year.
Yeah, I think that's
or just because there's a cheap, right? It's cheap, but what does that mean, right?
It's probably cheap for a reason, right?
Yeah, probably.
I'm just going to put the spotlight back on Sherry for a minute. You know, Sherry does a column for National Jeweler called On Data, and I think she just underscored a very important point, which is and this goes for sales, this goes for marketing. Look at the data. Like there's data on everything now. We have numbers tracking everything. You don't need to try to guess about, well, where is my advertising money best spent, or which product should I restock? Like you should be tracking this stuff and have data on it, and you should be making decisions on your business in this day and age based on data. So, you know, if you look at your customer and say, you know, I think I'm going to get a good return. A lot of my customers are on TikTok, or a lot of my customers, you know, even if there's nothing wrong with traditional media, if that's where your customers are. You know, if it's a local magazine, a billboard, a local television station or show, that's fine. But like, go where the data leads you. Like, let the data do the work for you. You don't have to guess, you know, what your best sellers are, where the best place is to advertise anymore. The numbers will show you. I mean, that's how we make a lot of our decisions around here on what we post on social media and what stories we cover. And we just, you know, look at what people are reading.
I would just add that I like this strategy of, and David was kind of, you know, pointing to this, but think longer term, you know, bet on yourself, bet in your business. Don't try to pick spots in the market. Just try to have a consistent approach to investing and growing your business over the medium and longer term. And it just seems like that tends to be, you know, the best strategy.
Agreed.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. That's the time that we had for our questions today. My next question will return next month with a session on the hottest jewelry trends for 2024. So you can register at either jewelers.org or nationaljeweler.com. Thank you again to hosts and panelists for joining us today, and please take care.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks. Have a great 2024.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.